Welcome back to our series on the Neosho Bass. In the first 3 parts of this series, we've covered the elevation of the species, the history of the research that led to that elevation, and last week we talked with 2 lifelong fishermen and guides on the Illinois River to hear anecdotes of how the fish they grew up catching are not the same as the fish that they catch today.
For this episode, we're going to be sitting down with 2 former stream biologists from the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation to talk about how we might be able to manage the protection of this species informed by the research we have today.
Now meet Trevor Starks and Tony Rodger as we ask them to talk about how this research can inform the boots on the ground management strategies.
At what point did you guys kind of hear about the Neosho Bass, or at what point did that become a part of your daily workload, or even if it wasn't daily, just part of your, like, this is something that we're working on in the background and we need to do more research here?
So when we started the Streams program in 2015, kind of since getting here, even I remember preparing for that interview, looking up some of Dr. Brewer's papers where she was studying the Neosho smallmouth bass, which was a subspecies at the time. So that was kind of my first introduction to it, realizing that it was something unique. And so kind of starting then. But I think the first data we collected, so we had in the fall, we would spend our time doing black bass surveys. And I think 2016 was the first time we collected data from the Illinois River. And it was pretty apparent, which was like age and growth data was one of the things, like the variability in the data was crazy, which is not something we typically see in Ozark streams. You know, we had like 2-year-old fish that were already over 14 inches. And then, you know, you had fish that were like 5 and 6 that, you know, were 10 or 11 inches. And we're like, what is going on here? Yeah. You know, like, so we were aware like Neosho smallmouth bass were, you know, something genetically different, but it was still at, I would say, the beginning of us understanding the biology and the ecology differences that were there as well. We were starting ourselves, I think, to start uncover some of that. And then we realized we're not really going to learn anything unless we have the genetics to go with it, so that we can parse out, like, okay, these were the Neoshos, these were the smallmouth, these were the hybrids. So now let's look at the data separately. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
So you're catching, say, a 14 or I don't remember exactly what you said, maybe a 12-inch 2-year-old. That was probably a Neosho or a hybrid. It's almost certainly not going to be just a smallmouth.
I remember going to Dr. Brewer's office at the time. I don't know if she'll remember this or not, but we sat down and we just mentioned offhand, like, yeah, we have Illinois River, we have smallmouth bass that are over 14 inches at 2 years. And I remember her being like, no that's not possible. And I'm like, I can send you the photos of the otoliths. Like, it's very clear they're 2 years old and this is how long they were. But yeah, it's just, you know, fast forward, now we understand a lot more of what was driving that. But at the time, it was just like, what is going on here?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, and I'm asking this question for my own education here. When it comes to the research that's been done on the Neosho, and you think about its distribution range, you've got Arkansas, you've got Oklahoma, Missouri, and then you guys are talking about just a little sliver of Kansas, which goes with the Ozarks. There's just a little sliver of the Ozarks and the Kansas too. It seems to me, because of some of the history of the Illinois, that there's a lot more research that's been done on the Oklahoma side as like specific to the Neosho. I know that Missouri's working on it, Arkansas is working on it. Everyone's doing some things, especially now with some of the new publications that have come out from Dr. Taylor and Dr. Long and all the research that's out there. Why is it that Oklahoma started looking into it maybe a little bit earlier when it relates to the Neosho bass?
I think a lot of that's probably the professors we had at Oklahoma State. Dr. Long and Dr. Burr are both originally from Missouri, so they're already in the Ozark area, and both were interested in black bass research. And so they just happened to both be at Oklahoma State at the right time. When that black bass diversity book came out, they both authored chapters in it. And then Andrew comes along, and he's already got a passion for doing black bass and specifically genetics. So it's kind of like the stars aligned. And then we just happened to start collecting standardized growth data. So for a lot of, as Tony mentioned, a lot of lakes, like any popular lake that anyone goes to, it's probably a really good chance that the area biologist is routinely collecting age and growth data on their fish populations, whether that's every year or once every other year, there was no standard rotation for stream fisheries at all. And so we started that in 2015. So we've got some data in the background, and then we find out that, you know, there's a little more interest in trying to find out more about this, you know, what did they call it? Unique genetic strain or subspecies. And Andrew and Jim started having us collect clips on the side, genetic clips, to put in vials while we're out doing our standard sampling. And it was just kind of a perfect storm of interest to all intersect at once. So,
yeah. And that's pretty common for states in general to have a much more robust data set on reservoirs. Because if you think about it, you know, there's boat ramps at every reservoir.
Right.
And that's the boat ramps that your agency is going to use to collect that data.
Yeah.
Well, a river and stream generally isn't going to have that kind of access.
Yeah.
It takes a lot more work to get in and out of a stream generally. What we did required a lot of like landowner participation because you're going around trying to get access. And so, you know, it's not necessarily something that every state can do. And Oklahoma decided, you know, put focused energy when we started back in 2015 on like, hey, let's make streams and rivers like a focus of our agency and dedicate people to that. Because if you put that on top of a reservoir biologist, they're just not going to have the time to do it justice. So we were given the freedom to kind of make the stream program what we wanted, you know, collect a bunch of data, and then, you know, kind of let our own interests, if you will, kind of like drive some of those directions that the stream program went. So,
Gotcha. Okay.
which aligned with, you know, Dr. Brewer, Dr. Long, Dr. Taylor, like we're all, you know, pretty much the eye to eye on, we all have the same interests, interested in the same questions, and like digging into that stuff.
Yeah. So what is the data set that you guys have formed? And from that, what have been some of the different things that we've been able to learn about the Neosho as it relates to, you know, I think size, age, different things like that? Break apart, what are some of the kind of key insights that you've seen that really differentiate the Neosho bass from the smallmouth bass?
I guess for me, it started, you know, as talked about collecting standardized growth data, and you collect all this data and you have the numbers in front of you, but you're like, what does that mean? Like, how do we contextualize that? And of course you can do just a stream versus stream comparison, but then I'm thinking, where do we stand nationally? Like where do our riverine, like how does the growth in our riverine systems compare to national averages? And so we wanted to do a growth standards paper where we talked to biologists in any state that would answer the phone or answer an email that had age and growth data specifically from riverine populations, because we suspected that they likely grow different. There had been some reports out there, but there was never a paper that had said definitively like, yes, stream fish grow different than lake fish, and this is how. And so we had that data set. I don't remember how many fish we ended up with at the end of the project. I think
About
it was
25,000, I think.
something like
Oh,
that.
wow.
Like it was a good amount of fit, and you know,
Across how many
From
states?
all over.
all over. I mean, we're talking Maine, South Dakota, some introduced populations in. Did we have one in Utah?
Yeah, it ended up being
Really
most
spread
of
out.
what their range is. So, I mean, the
Sure.
smallmouth bass is native to 23 states
Right.
originally in the like East Central United States, but because they're so popular, that's more than doubled, like just in the United States alone. And then you
Okay.
have, you know, in addition to the U.S., like 8 other countries now that smallmouth bass occur because people just can't stop putting them in places because they want to fish for them.
People love smallmouth.
So we had a lot of data from, you know, places that were introduced populations that spanned. We wanted to get, you know, as large of a geographic area as possible because there can be geographic differences in
Yeah.
growth. So, it was almost 25,000 fish, and I think 11 to 13 states total
Okay.
for that riverine study that we did.
Yeah.
Right. And so from that, we basically had a standard. So for each population, you run like a growth curve for it, and it tells you generally like what the growth characteristics of that population are. When you have that giant data set, it basically tells you what the average fish in the U.S., like how it grows. It gives you percentiles like this. Here's your 50% mark or your 50th percentile mark. Where does everything stack up? And Illinois River popped out. Like it really popped out as far as like kind of off the charts growth. But like Tony said, usually when you do a growth curve like this, you've got your total length on the y-axis of the graph. I'm not going to get too far into details, but you have age on the x. You have age 1, 2, 3, and typically fish stack up. Like most of your age 1 fish are all about the same size, and you go up to age 2, they're all about the same size, and it just builds this little line graph. Illinois was messy. Like you would get in age 1 and you would have, like Tony said, really short and really long fish. And it was just like that. It was really, really messy. And that's where the Neosho questions started coming up. Like,
Okay.
I think we've got, and that happened, I think we published that in 2020, and Andrew had done his first genetic survey in 2018.
I think that's when it was
first report.
published and the genetics had
Yeah, the
come
first
from a little
report.
earlier.
Okay.
So we knew that there was some hybridization going on, but there was still some pure smallmouth and Neosho in the same system. And that's what kind of led to us diving more deep into growth of Neosho bass specifically.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So what were the findings then on age and growth typically based on the research?
So a Neosho bass we found out is like very short-lived for one. So if you think of like a smallmouth bass from parts of its native range in like, the upper Midwest, they can live up to 20 years old in like those colder climates. We rarely see a Neosho bass hit 6 years old down here.
Significantly shorter.
Significantly shorter. The oldest one we've ever aged was 8 years old. But in our entire statewide, or Ozark data set, if you will, like about 1% of them hit that 6-year-old mark. And in that same respect, about 1% of them hit the 14-inch mark. So that, like the growth model that he's talking about, we also did one just for all our Neosho bass data we're collecting in Oklahoma. And then we were also working on, getting data from the other states that have these populations, combining it together, and we ran that analysis as well. And that's something we hope continues to get built upon, including more streams to make that data even more representative. But for where it stands right now, you look at that growth curve, and it basically tells you that your average maximum length for a Neosho bass is about 13 inches. It's not saying they can only get to 13 inches, but your average fish is going to kind of top out at 13. The longest fish we had in a data set where we had genetically confirmed Neosho bass was about 16 3/4 inches.
Okay.
And so you could kind of think of that as your current like world record right now.
Yeah,
It's
that
like
would be
just under 17
granddaddy.
inches.
So there's not even one on the books, so it would be.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Be the
right,
one.
right.
So that's like, you hear a lot about, smallmouth bass, if you catch one that's a decent size, it took a long time to get there, which is why you should let it go.
Right.
And for Neoshos, they're just such a short-lived species. The ones that, yes, it's true, the ones that are 14 are probably anywhere between 6 to 8 years old. So that is kind of an old fish, but it's very much at the end of its life. It's not like it's got 10 more years of growth potential. On the other side, we had the Illinois River smallmouth bass, where when we had that national average, that national average tells us that it takes about 15 years for a smallmouth bass to hit trophy size, which is 20 inches.
Okay.
Illinois River bass get there in about 7 to 8.
Really?
So it's about like almost twice as fast. And of the fish that we aged that were that 20-inch size and above, we had ages as young as 5 up to 11. So we had 5-year-old fish already hitting a 20-inch mark, which is just, it's remarkable
And
growth.
this is pure strain smallmouth.
These were fish
Yes.
that came back, genetically confirmed. These are your smallmouth bass.
Wow.
Yes.
Like Cropter's Dolomieu.
Yes.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. When you break it down by specific ages, like if you look at age 1 Neosho bass compared to the national average compared to age 1 smallmouth bass in the Illinois River, Neosho bass comes out hot. Like age 1 is about in the 60th percentile, so they're still above national average. And then by the time you get to, I think it's like age 8, they're already like 37th percentile in growth. And by the time you get to like even farther out, basically at the end of their life, they're like 0th percentile. Whereas an age 1 smallmouth bass, an age 3 smallmouth bass, and an age 8 smallmouth bass out of this river are in the 99th percentile when it comes to national comparisons.
Gotcha. So
it's a crazy difference.
Said in layman's terms, in plain and simple, Neosho, they don't live as long. They also don't get as big as a Micropterus Dolomieu, the smallmouth. But you were mentioning earlier, they actually grow a little bit faster than the smallmouth. You see the age 1 Neoshos outpace the smallmouth. But then besides all of that, on the Illinois, they both just grow really fast. Is that what I'm hearing you guys say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Relative to the rest of the country.
This
Yes.
watershed in general supports higher than average Neosho bass growth.
Okay.
But when you're going to take a Neosho bass in this river and compare it to a smallmouth bass, it gets blown out of the water by the smallmouth.
Okay.
But yes, this watershed generally supports faster than average growth for a Neosho bass compared to the other Ozark streams that we've studied, you know, in like the Grand River watershed. And then this year, I think they're going to collect some data more in the Boston Mountains. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes out, like Little Lee Creek, how that compares.
Right.
But yeah, so it's a short-lived species that grows slow. They, live fast, die young.
Yeah.
But the smallmouth, like I said, our oldest was 11, but I wouldn't be surprised, if they ended up getting one a little bit older than that, like in that 12 to 15 year range. But they're probably never going to find like a 20-year-old smallmouth bass out of the Illinois River just because of the latitude.
Gotcha.
So like in warmer climates, it generally helps growth, but that means it's not going to live as long.
I see.
So like, higher metabolism and all that doesn't generally contribute to a longer lifespan.
Yeah.
But they're reaching the size, everybody likes to go up north to catch big smallmouth. And it might take that smallmouth 15, 20 years to get there. Well, here it's like 7 years and boom, they're there.
Gotcha.
Wow. So
That's fascinating.
yeah.
I didn't know that.
See, I'm learning more about the Micropterus dolomu than I realized
Yeah.
what too on this
Yeah, right.
episode. I thought we were going
Right.
all VLOX.
Velox.
All
Well,
the
and
Neosho.
so what we found was interesting too is like, there are some, studies with different organisms and stuff where you have something called hybrid vigor, where it's like, well, you have two closely related species, when they reproduce, like the offspring, that first generation offspring actually shows like higher growth than either of the parents. But that's not what we found with this data set. Basically, we found like the more Neosho is in a fish, like the more it drags that growth down.
Gotcha.
So, if you had a back cross smallmouth, that was, 75% smallmouth, it's going to grow a lot closer to that smallmouth bass than, one that's got 25% smallmouth in it. So essentially, the more smallmouth that's in that individual, the more genes of a smallmouth it has, the faster it grows.
What were some of the other findings? I know you guys did some stuff, and you sent me some stuff on like diet, maybe ecology, like where you find them, their habitat, stuff like that. What were some other insights that you guys looked into?
Yeah, so on the diet side, that was part of one of the projects we did. It was kind of the thought of, it wasn't the focus, but we're collecting all this data. We're going to have genetics. Like, when else are you going to have a chance to know, like, this is the smallmouth, this is a hybrid, this is a Neosho, and so we can accurately classify them as such and then compare their diets. And you find like a lot of anglers are generally interested in like, what are a fish eating, right?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like number one question.
Yeah.
It's like that every time you fillet a fish and you see something in that stomach, it's like it's hard not to cut that open and be like, what was in there,
Yeah.
So we decided to look at that, kind of to like sum all that up. Well, first I'll say Neosho Bass as a whole, like if you look at just general Ozark streams. So we also did some work in Spavinaw Creek, which is in a different watershed, but it's a very typical Ozark stream, very high crayfish population. And you find what is in the literature a lot is like the crayfish is kind of like the most important prey item for those Neosho bass. And then that's followed by stone roller. And if you took basically those two
Central
prey
stone roller
items,
minnow fish, yeah.
you took basically those two, and that's basically, they make most of their living off that. And there were some subtle seasonal differences where, darters were like fairly important in the spring, but they're kind of replaced by mad toms in the summer. So there were some like subtle nuances to the Neosho Bass diets in that stream, but in general, it was like crayfish, stone rollers, and then everything else, right? And so we kind of took the same approach here, but it gets complicated, right? Because we had 4 different streams in that study, right? From the Illinois River, which is the largest main stem river, and then 3 of its tributaries. Well, there aren't a lot of crayfish in the Illinois River, or the Barren Fork for that matter. And then we also had 2 of the smaller tribs, which have higher crayfish populations. So you have genetics is like, so are genetics playing a role? But you also have like, well, where was this fish collected? That could be playing a role. Then you also have like, what's the size of the fish? That could be playing a role.
Yeah.
So we
So it's
decided
pretty messy once you start getting into it of like, how do we isolate really what's going on here with
Yes.
what is this fish eating?
Yes. So what we did was analyze it all 3 ways to see what were the biggest differences. And so when we split everything out just by like, hey, you're a Neosho Bass, you're a smallmouth bass, there were differences, but they were slight. The bigger differences that popped out in that study were size and then stream. And it makes sense because like where you are kind of dictates what you can eat, right? Like that prey base in that stream is going to be unique to that stream. You can't really go outside what's available.
Right.
And they are opportunistic in the sense that, whatever is readily most available is generally what you'll see most in their diets.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're not calling Uber Eats and like, hey, bring me a different fish from that river.
Yeah, exactly. So in the Illinois, we only, for example, saw crayfish in about 10% of the diets. But you look like in an Ozark stream, that's usually anywhere from 50 to like 70% of the diets.
Illinois is heavy on shad, right?
Yes. Yeah. So if you float it, like you'll see big schools of shad. Mm-hmm. You'll see a lot of shiners, different species of shiners, a lot of still central stone rollers. It's a very heavy fish base, which might be contributing to that growth because while crayfish are readily available, they're also, they have that hard exoskeleton, right? And they can't assimilate as much energy out of a crayfish as they can a fish.
Yeah.
I think somebody looked at it once, and basically, like, if you had a fish, like 95% of that fish can be turned into that smallmouth bass, assimilated into that smallmouth bass.
Gotcha.
It's much lower on a crayfish because they're not getting much out of that exoskeleton.
It probably takes, a lot of calories too to digest that hard shell and work through it. It's like me eating a piece of celery. Isn't celery? It's like just as much calories as it is to actually digest it, all the cellulose and all that stuff.
Right. So the Illinois, what we saw is basically you have a much higher use of fish. Those smaller tributaries, you still had that crayfish use, which really made the diets stand out. But again, part of that is like you have a lot more Neoshos in those tributaries too, so it's still hard to tease out like, well, is it location or is it genetics? And then size-wise, we saw like as fish got larger, they can tend to expand their prey base a little bit. Mm-hmm. So when you get into those bigger smallmouth, they could maybe take advantage of those gizzard shad or your other tall-bodied prey species like your long-eared sunfish or your bluegills.
Channel cat.
Trevor caught a 21-inch smallmouth bass this morning that had a channel catfish sticking out of its mouth. I've seen a photo
crazy
from somebody that fishes this river all the time who had an 8 or 9-inch white bass that he pulled out of the stomach of one of these trophy smallmouth. So with any species, the bigger it gets, the more that window of opportunity opens.
Yeah, that makes sense. The bigger the fish, the bigger their food can be and likely will be.
Yes.
So if you have a Neosho that doesn't get as big, it's 14 inches, it's going to be a little bit more limited as to what it can eat.
Yes. Yep. So basically, to kind of summarize all that up, the size played more of an important role, as well as location did more than just if you compare genetics to genetics.
And you said 3 angles: size, location, or 2.
Like size of the fish is 1,
right?
So we grouped them by size class.
Okay, so that's angle 1.
So it's all similar size fish together, and then genetics. You're a Neosho, you're a hybrid, you're a smallmouth, and then location. So all the fish from Flint Creek were in one group. All the fish from Caney Creek, Bear Fork, Illinois River, all separate groups.
Okay, cool.
Which it's not we didn't have as big a sample size from some of those smaller tribs, so it would have been nice to kind of have more data on that front. But our Flint Creek diets looked very similar to what we saw in Spavinaw Creek, just heavy crayfish use. And that surprised us because we just kind of assumed we would see crayfish dominating the diets here.
Yeah.
And as we were going through them, we were actually kind of like, this is weird. And there was actually a crayfish research project going on at the time. One of Dr. Brewer's students, and I called him and I was like, are you finding any crayfish in the Illinois River when you're doing all your surveys? And they weren't actually able to sample the Illinois, but they did sample the Barren Fork. And he's like, funny you asked, because first couple of times I did this, it was like my first stream that I was working on. And I called Dr. Brewer. I'm like, am I doing this wrong? Because I am not catching any. But the Barren Fork was the same. We only saw about 10% crayfish frequency of occurrence in their diets. And so the Illinois and the Barren Fork, for whatever reason, just don't seem to have that much crayfish available to be preyed on.
So it was mainly size and location. And you were saying between the Neosho and the smallmouth, it doesn't really differentiate genetically other than size. Because the smallmouth gets so much bigger, that's where you started seeing the differences between the two species.
Yeah, some different, and a Neosho might be more willing to feed on invertebrates than a smallmouth bass would. That kind of popped out too. Okay. So if you looked at it by genetics class, smallmouth bass usually more than the hybrids and the Neoshos were feeding on invertebrates less. So whether that be your Dobson fly larvae or your mayfly, they tended to not use that as much. But
I've heard somebody say that the Neosho is, it's kind of like a trout in the way that they eat and even the way they hold into water. And I know that's not a perfect comparison, but even just hearing you say that they're going to eat more larvae of aquatic insects kind of thing, and the types of water that they like and the types of structure they like and the fast moving clear stream that they like, I don't know what to do with that other than it's just an interesting observation of they just do different. They do a little bit differently than a smallmouth.
They're just they're fluvial specialists, so they are river stream adapted. They don't want to be in the big sluggish pools. They don't want to be in a lake. They want to be in the current. Whereas a smallmouth bass can be more of a generalist. So you can catch them out of a variety of habitats. So the habitat-wise, speaking of that.
We actually had a system where we had a side project where we compared diets of rainbow trout that had been released in the system to the native Neosho. And there was a lot of overlap at a certain size. I can't remember off the top of my head, but basically rainbow trout and then a certain size Neosho bass, their diets were very, very similar. So there's a little bit to that.
There's some truth to that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You mentioned One, fluvial, cool word.
Fluvial adapted. That sounds like a T-shirt.
Fluvial specialist. Yeah, that'd be a great T-shirt.
Specialist. There we go.
I like
Fluvial
that.
specialist.
So that you kind of were touching on ecology. Did you guys do specific research, or was that more anecdotal of like, we typically find them in a little bit different places?
Some of that's anecdotal, but I know that the specific, like the trout project in general, that was another Shannon Brewer student project where they were looking at habitat use of Neosho bass before this stocking of just, I mean, we can go down the politics and everything that go with what happened there, but rainbow trout get stocked on top. And so you're looking at where these fish like to be. So you're snorkeling, they found where the fish is at, they took some habitat, depth, substrate, where it's holding that in the water column, things like that. And then they found that you put these giant rainbow trout in on top and they kind of get displaced. So they definitely keyed in on some areas that Neosho bass like to be. And it definitely seems like you put a bigger, possibly more piscivorous, aggressive animal in on the system, they displace them out of those areas they want to be. So there's definitely, as Tony alluded to, definitely more of a specialized habitat where a smallmouth bass, you could find them in that pool, in that run, at the bottom of the riffle. They're just kind of everywhere. So,
Yeah, gotcha.
There hasn't been any, like in Illinois, for example, where you have like both in the same water body, where there hasn't been any like microhabitat work done on that.
Right.
And the difficulty of that is like, you would have to somehow get the genetics off the fish immediately before you let it go, because you're not going to catch it back.
It seems like
So
a very challenging study to conduct.
Yes.
Yeah.
You would have to sample the fish,
Like as you're observing
genotype
it.
them,
Yeah.
hold them for a while, and then put them back out there
Yeah.
to make sure you knew like which fish was which. So it's just like those studies get hard to do because it's just like they're just not practical a lot of times.
Yeah, that makes sense. But typically, and anecdotally speaking, you typically find the Neoshos in a little bit swifter water. They prefer that more specialized habitat versus, and that even goes to the point of like when Tin Killer was built and the impoundment was built, you didn't see the Neoshos like take over the lake. Right. They stayed up into the tributaries and in the main river stem, and then essentially it created an opportunity for like, hey, we want to bring in these smallmouth that thrive in lakes from Tennessee and these other states, which again just kind of goes to the point of like they just prefer different places. This is a different fish that we're talking about.
Yes, and that does bring up an interesting point of if you want to like scale out more, just like in terms of habitat preference. Dr. Long mentioned, there seems to be an affinity for larger systems, like larger rivers for smallmouth bass, which might be one of the mechanisms that keeps it maybe from hybridizing some of our smaller tribs. And that research we did, there's a very strong spatial component to where kind of our hybrid zones are. Like the closer you are to 10 killer, the more smallmouth bass you're going to find. As a whole, the Illinois River, we genotyped over 700 fish out of the river, and 70% of them, 70% of those 700 were hybrids of some sort. So it's already just basically been a compromised system. It's a hybrid swarm. But within the river, like as you move upstream, like you do run into more and more Neosho genetics, to where if you're in like the upper part of the upper Illinois River, like 30% of those fish were still pure Neosho. But if you're down in the lower part of the upper river, it was like about 5% were pure Neoshos.
So much less.
So those smallmouth bass tend to like that, bigger type of system.
I've been wanting to ask somebody about that this whole time of like how, because I get how, bigger water, whatever, the smallmouth, that's what they want. They don't want to go up into your little streams. And every time we keep having this conversation, kind of rehashing it, I'm thinking, but what about the things that are hybridizing and they move all over? Like at what point is there, call it what you want, black and white, and then a whole lot of gray that just keeps reproducing more gray, if you will.
No, that's
is that what you're seeing? Like kind of zones of, you got the pure strain up here in different water. As it gets mixed water, it's more hybrid fish, and then the more smallmouth acclimated type streams.
Right, and that was part of that other secondary objective of that study was Andrew had published that first survey in 2018. And so you have these pie charts of like, this is where the fish was collected. This was the, how many smallmouth alleles it had and where that's distributed basically from Lake Tin Killer all the way up. And when we did We did an angler survey, like a human dimension survey, where we had collected and tagged a bunch of fish, but also took clips on them to genotype them. And then we did the age and growth study. And so you have these kind of time series data where you have 2018, this is what it looks like. And as you move through time with those clips that are more recently collected, it seems like that gray area that you alluded to earlier is moving upstream.
It's moving up.
Yes, and it's becoming more gray. Yeah, bigger area.
Is it because, and I realize there may not be a definitive answer to this, is it because the Tennessee strain smallmouth were stocked in the lake, so that's the starting point, and so that's why you see more smallmouth genetics down in the lake and closer to that? And so over time, we would just expect those genetics to continue to spread up into the tributaries, or is it more a matter of like they actually do just prefer different habitats?
Well, we actually found a historical stocking record from the upper part of the watershed as well, which was a surprise to us. So everybody knows about the 10-killer stockings, but when we were digging into it and looking at what ODC has recorded as their historical stocking records, there was also 42 like adult smallmouth bass stocked into Ballard Creek, which is a tributary of the Illinois, which enters above Lake Francis, which is a low water dam essentially near the Arkansas border. And it's a small stream.
Up by Siloam.
Yes. So what we know of smallmouth
tiny,
is probably they immediately went downstream. But they would have been, upstream of that dam. But any high water event, fish could theoretically come over that. But what it probably automatically did was also, like, we took samples from above that dam. There were smallmouth bass signatures up there. So it was kind of a top and bottom stocking. And so that's what makes it so hard to know exactly.
Both sides.
Because it can, you think of an initial stocking in a reservoir like the size of 10-killer. It's not like overnight. It's a smallmouth bass fishery, right? And I've seen in literature where, some introduced populations have taken 4 or 5 generations of smallmouth bass, 40, 50 years before you really see that population take off. And so it likely slowly built in 10-killer. And a lot of fish movement studies will show that you generally have the majority of fish that stay in a relatively small area, but most populations will have like flyers where they're like, you know what, I'm going to go way upstream. And so you likely had some of those individuals over time that went up the Illinois River and were like, you know what, it's pretty nice up here. There's a lot of food up here. There's good spawning habitat. I'm just going to stay. And that starts it. And then it just slowly accumulates. Every time they spawn with the Neosho, you got a batch of hybrids out there. When they spawn, you got another batch of hybrids to the point where now, 70% of them are hybrids. And what does that mean for the future? That's like, the $1 million question. We also stratified our samples in the Barren Fork, which is the next biggest tributary. And our most recent genetic collections there, that lower segment of the Barren Fork was like 60% Neosho, 40% hybrids, basically. Very few like pure smallmouth bass, but already 40% hybrids like in that zone. So will that continue to creep up in the Barren Fork? Maybe.
Yeah. It seemed like there was a perfect storm with you and Dr. Taylor and others at the time you all working together to even care about a fish like the Neosho that led to studies, that led to more studies, that led to now the findings that we have on the Neosho, which is just amazing in itself. Like if it wasn't for y'all's curiosity and even, feeling of personal responsibility towards it, we may not even be having this conversation of like, oh yeah, there's a different fish in the stream that we need to care about. So that's one fascinating. And then now we've just entered in the conversation of hybrid fish and how they're moving up and down or just kind of all around, I guess, in the rivers.
And the further you get away from the lake, typically you see a higher percentage of Neosho genetics.
But we did find a pure smallmouth bass. Like basically, if you've ever been to Francis, it's like a waterfall, and now it's a whitewater park, but it wasn't at the time. Like in the outflow of that waterfall, like we netted a smallmouth bass that turned out to be pure smallmouth bass. So that's like 100 river kilometers up from 10-killer.
Wow.
So they're using the entire system. They're just much more rare as you go upstream.
Got it. But it does establish, based on the percentages, there's a difference between where they live.
Yes.
And so you've got age and growth are different. You've got diets are different. And there's a variety of factors within that. And then you've got where they live is different. So what do we do with that information, given that there's a lot of challenges that go with that? And we can talk about those maybe after, but you've got this specific research. What do you do with it?
Well, I guess starting off, you talked about the human dimension study that Dr. Taylor had done, and basically a lot of that was what we use in fisheries are called creel surveys. So you go to, it's a lot easier, or not easier, but in a lake you can just drive your boat around and interview anglers or meet them at ramps when they're coming to or from the lake and ask like, what were you fishing for? Why are you out here? How many trips do you take? And you can get an idea of economic impact and how much money people are spending to come to your lake. And so we did a creel survey here on the Illinois River. And to no surprise to anybody, as like any creel surveyor, people are like, we like big fish. We want big fish. And if we had the option of catching a native or a big fish, we want the big fish. That's what we want. And so there's always that challenge, right? Because we just explained that these fish don't get that big. So why should we care about it? But the ray of sunshine in that scenario is that when you're doing a study like that, you have to ask questions in a very dry, objective way. So you're not leading people to give you the answer they want. You just got to give them like the very generic question.
Yeah.
If you explained it to them like you led into the first episode of the podcast, where it's like, you have a critter that's literally or figuratively, depending on who you are, in your backyard.
Yeah.
That's the only place in the world that it's found. Like, I think people might start to think a little different about the size versus the native genetic side of things.
Yeah.
So I definitely think there's some education and just some getting the word out, just like this podcast is doing, that this is a unique critter that you should care about. But in terms of the size question, it gets really murky here because we just explained that it looks like, I don't know if the system's completely gone, like as far as like, will we ever have a good stronghold of pure Neosho fish in this river again? I don't really know, and I don't think there's a good way to, I don't think there'd be a good way to put the cat in the bag, back in the bag. Like it's already out. You've got non-native genetics in here, but you also are left with a fishery that produces some really fast-growing fish. And so maybe there's a way to balance those two things where we have our size here. You already have an opportunity to catch a trophy smallmouth bass in a river system that's, I don't know, relatively small when you think about some of the big systems that they can exist in. And we really focus in on areas where we still have Neosho bass strongholds and conserve those areas to the best we can.
Gotcha.
And we basically balance the two, essentially. So I don't know. Part of that is this is some of the things that we talked about with Dr. Taylor or Andrew at the conclusion of that study is like, well, what can we do for these systems where we know they're still relatively, and I know he didn't like to use the term pure, but like the Neosho genome is still intact in these rivers and we don't have any hybridization going on. Something that he brought up is maybe having these genetic management units where we're basically going back and instead of just going back and collecting age and growth data like we normally would have, we take some clips. We go and get them sequenced and we find out like, okay, we still don't have any smallmouth genetics here, so they're still good. But when you do a genetic survey like that, you can get an idea of how inbred the population is. Okay. And there's always a small degree of inbreeding in most populations, but when it gets to a certain level, you kind of reach this kind of critical threshold where like this could actually be really bad for the population. And
what do you mean by that? Like inbreeding. I think of inbreeding as like within the same family.
Yes, like
is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Yes, yeah. Where you basically
so to
have
some level, you want that to keep the pure Neosho strain, but if it's too close, that's where you create problems.
Right. You have like these deleterious alleles. You have like these basically random mutations that are just keep getting passed on when you have a lot of inbreeding going on, and it can lead to reduced fitness.
Gotcha.
And so when you go and you do like a monitoring survey like this, and you're like, okay, the inbreeding coefficient that we got out of this population is going up, and it looks like it's headed in the wrong direction. And as Dr. Long alluded to in the first episode, these populations, Tony had said it earlier, you usually have a big subset of the population that's kind of hanging out in the same area, but you have flyers that want to move a lot. And so historically, before we built all these dams, there was still some genetic exchange of material between streams. You might have a Caney Creek fish might make it up into the Barren Fork, whereas now we've got a lake that these fish don't want to move in anymore, where they're not moving between areas. So maybe we do some genetic monitoring, and if maybe we're finding that the inbreeding coefficient is going on, you go to the next nearest stream where you have good genetics, and you might move some fish. It's just some human-assisted migration where you could kind of keep the gene pool fresh.
Yeah.
So that's another option we could do for our remaining strongholds.
Yeah, it occurs with other species in Oklahoma. Like they're doing it for paddlefish. You have these reservoirs that have segmented these systems, and so as a way to keep that gene mixing that was historically present, they move paddlefish from Keystone to Grand Lake to do the same thing. So yeah, it's not possible for them to do it themselves in some areas now.
Yeah, because humans have intervened.
Yeah, so you might have a tributary that runs right into Grand Lake, and like Trevor said, they're not going to swim up through Grand Lake to get to that next tributary. Whereas, you know, in the past when it was the Neosho main stem, they might have. And so it's just using that genetic monitoring to make sure nobody's, because one of the most common methods of smallmouth being moved around is like somebody putting them in their live well and being like, you know what, it'd be a lot easier if I could catch this in my backyard instead of driving a 10 killer. And people have told us that, like, oh yeah, we go down and catch smallmouth and we bring them back to our creek, and it's like, so yeah, you have people doing that. And so if you're kind of just, we never checked on those genetics before, you know. The smallmouth were stocked back in the 1990s, but the first, you know, when we realized that they were different, ODWC back in the late 90s decided, okay, no more stocking, but you can't control like what people do with their live wells and bait buckets.
Right.
But nobody was out there like checking these other streams, be like, how much are these getting moved around? So you keep tabs on that. So if you do have an introduction, you can try to get ahead of it. You know, like Trevor said, the Illinois River is so far gone. Like you can't separate it from 10 killer, and so it could always be recolonized. But these streams that aren't having these issues, like keep them that way.
Yeah.
Keep them pure.
Yeah. That makes sense. So there may be some need for some genetic mixing if things start to go the wrong direction as far as inbreeding within these pockets of kind of Neosho strongholds. Is kind of what you're getting at there. When it comes to size, very clear in the data you guys saw that the Neosho typically doesn't get bigger than 14 inches. Less than 1% even make it to that, or 1% make it to that. What about like specific size and length limits that you could potentially do to manage the smallmouth of the Neosho? Are there opportunities there to benefit the Neosho?
Well, currently the statewide stream minimum length limit is still 14 inches, which is kind of handy because, as we said earlier, Neosho bass rarely get that big. In fact, when you take the Neosho growth model that Tony talked about earlier, and there's a metric we like to use just because for the longest time, the statewide reg was 14 inches. So we want to know for your given population, how fast does it take an average fish in that population to get to 14 inches? When you try to do that with Neosho bass, it gives you a big NA. It doesn't even calculate it because it's like the average fish doesn't get that big.
Yeah.
So the good thing about this system is if you are going to harvest, which we find is really rare with black bass anglers in general, but if you do harvest a fish that meets that minimum length limit, there's a good chance it's either a hybrid or a smallmouth bass. So you are doing, I guess, some good in that sense. It's likely you could never get enough harvest to make, you know, a huge difference, but that's something that, you know, maybe in this system, a little more harvest wouldn't be a bad thing, especially with that size limit.
For the smallmouth.
For the smallmouth, because anything that's bigger is likely a hybrid or a smallmouth. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it goes back to
people
that.
sending you hate emails.
Right, yeah, well, I mean,
That's a whole other can
Yeah.
of worms.
Yeah.
So it's got to kind of tie back into that education component where you're like encouraging harvest. So many people are so, you know, dead set. We found that out in that creel survey. What was interesting is we did find there were slight differences among like the angler demographics that used the different streams in this watershed. Like we had people that fished Caney Creek were mostly locals. They did show like a tendency to be more harvest oriented, and they said they actually wish the bag limit was higher. But you ask somebody floating the Barren Fork, they're like, we would never keep a smallmouth. Yeah, so it's like, even within this small watershed, you have different user groups that have different expectations, which makes people management the hardest part of fishery management. Is you can't ever have a regulation that makes everybody happy, which in one sense kind of makes this such a unique opportunity to have your cake and eat it too, because you could theoretically manage the Illinois River as a trophy smallmouth bass fishery. Like throw in the towel, like we can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's producing a world-class smallmouth bass fishery right now. Let's just go with it. And everywhere we don't have a smallmouth bass problem, let's focus on Neosho bass conservation to preserve this unique species in the Ozarks. And yeah, you could use like, you know, that genetic monitoring goes hand in hand, keep tabs on it, but also keep that 14-inch minimum in place so it allows a little bit of harvest. And if it happens to be a Neosho, that's a rare fish that gets harvested, but, you know, maybe it was that random smallmouth or a hybrid that did get into there. And you could, you know, even increase the limit, so allow people to take more, and you typically see like a 1/20-inch length limit on trophy smallmouth bass. It's pretty common.
Yeah.
So something like that, and just, you know, be like, okay, everybody that loves to catch big smallmouth, head here.
Yeah, fish to
And
Illinois.
these are our Neosho streams. And, let's not move fish around. Let's appreciate it for what it is. Get the word out there. Georgia has done they have a really good program like celebrating their black bass diversity where they reward their anglers for catching the different species and they send them something, it turns into like a challenge. So you could do something similar like that in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. That's fascinating. There's a couple things there to kind of tease out. One is that, so back to what was said earlier, there was human intervention in the impoundments. Back to the, there may be some need for genetic, I guess, remixing that was occurring historically, but maybe now isn't. With that, you've got, I think about the people who say like, well, why don't we just like sit back and let nature take its course and like do what nature's going to do and let everything just happen. And I don't know, I wrestle with that because in some ways I'm like, okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying. But then also too, it's like we started this when we started building the dams in the 50s and before that. And now to then just go hands off and let all these fish go completely inbred and basically become like unfit fish that can't even survive in their own home. It's like that doesn't feel right either. And so we can't go back in time, but the current situation is we have both. There's some benefit to having both. And, we talked about big fish bring more tourism. People come in and they want to catch big fish. But then you also have this other side it's a native fish, and this is the only place in the world you can catch it, and that's really cool too. And so you kind of really have to, carve those pieces out and protect those two things separately, but at the same time, because they're going to overlap. And it's a really, really challenging thing to do.
And part of it, I think, is they look so similar to a smallmouth bass, right? It is hard in your head to catch something that looks like a smallmouth bass that might be 11 inches and be like, wow, I got a really good one.
Right.
Because, generally that's not that great of a smallmouth bass.
Yeah.
But they look so similar. But if you were going bluegill fishing, you caught a 10-inch bluegill, you'd be like, wow, trophy, huge bluegill. So you have to get people, which goes back to the education, reframe their context around this fish. Like there was a study back in the 50s and they did the same thing at Creel Survey. And they found most fish were 10 inches, rarely 12 inches.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you get that in your head, hey, I'm going to this stream, anything I catch over 10 inches is that's a really big fish.
Yeah.
If you go into it with that mindset, you're not going to be disappointed, right? If you're expecting that fish to be 20 inches and you catch a 10-incher, you're disappointed.
Or if you're just expecting it to be a smallmouth.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Right.
Right. And recognizing that it's a different species, and also with the new, the world record basically slots that they've created for a lot of these species, that helps that along.
Oh, yeah.
Where you have now you have a goal, if I'm in this watershed, in this stream, everything we know about it, this is a pure Neosho system, and I catch a 14-inch Neosho. That's a goal to strive for.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
That is one of the things, and I was thinking about, challenges with all of this that we're talking about. IDing the fish is challenging for the common guy who maybe, someone who's listening to this podcast, they're saying, that's cool, I love it, but how do I know when I go out and I'm fishing and I catch something, how do I know if this 12-inch fish is a really nice, solid Neosho, or it's like a kind of an immature smallmouth bass? And then how do I celebrate that? Is the best way to maybe do that based on location right now? Or are there things that you guys have found here's a couple things that you can look it's not 100%, but it gets you pretty close?
I think it's pretty well. Location is kind of the silver bullet character right now, but if you go up to Headwater Caney Creek and you go down to 10 Killer and you take a fish from that system and compare it from the other system, there are going to be some striking differences, but I've taken the most extreme representatives of those two species. Whereas when I think of a Neosho, I think about that first fish I caught in the Barren Fork was just a streamlined torpedo that was almost mustard yellow, where you get into 10 Killer and you start getting those traditional northern football dinner plate, dark green, maybe some black or chocolate stripes
Some
going on it.
bronze.
And you look at those two examples and you're like, yeah,
This is
I
easy.
got this. Yeah, that's obviously different than that. But then all of those characters I just described occur on a spectrum that completely overlap each other.
Right,
And
especially
so-
when you get into hybrid.
Yes, and then then you get in the gray zone, and it's everything goes out the door. But generally, it's body shape, location, and you got to basically take all those things in concert with each other to make a determination. But it's usually less of a yes, no, or this or that, and more of a it's probably this. Most likely, it's this.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
if you were like interested in like, you know, and you lived in Arkansas and you wanted to catch a Neosho, I would say, you know, calling your biologist in that state sounds like they're starting that process of figuring out what we have where, you know, let's check if some of the stockings we did in the past is causing some of these same issues in Arkansas, you know, have those conversations and have them give you a list of streams like, hey, we're pretty confident that we have no introgression here.
Yeah.
So you can go fish that stream and, you know, check that Neosho off your list. And you can also catch a bunch of fish and start putting it together like, okay, this is what a Neosho looks like. And kind of, you know, the more you hold something, the more it becomes obvious.
Yeah.
You know, we did a lot of community fish work too, where you're like holding minnows. And to the average person, you hold 2 minnows and they're like, how would you ever tell those
Yeah,
apart?
it's like, that's a minnow and that's a minnow.
Yeah, but if you look at thousands of them, you're like, you don't even have to like do the counts or anymore. You just be like, that's that and that's that because of the way it is. You know, you can just tell.
Yeah.
And so the more you get in your hand, the more it's obvious. But I would start with that location. Ask like, hey, where can I go and catch a Neosho?
Yeah.
And then just kind of start building up those images in your head on what typically you'll see.
Yeah. I know you guys are not, you know, you're no longer employed by ODWC. You guys have gone different ways. Within Oklahoma, for someone listening who they're like, man, I want to go see one. I want to go catch one. Where are the places that you would say, here's some places to check out that you can go and find some Neoshos?
That's the other issue with obviously them liking smaller systems is a lot of that area doesn't have as much public access.
Sure.
But I'm thinking Upper Barren Fork would be a good spot that's got good public access. That
we
has
have
relatively intact.
Yeah, we have 2 properties. ODWC has 2 properties on the Upper Barren Fork, public access. You can wade fish. And from our upper segment, those results came back 100% were pure Neoshos. That's not to say that, you know, there aren't fish that are moving up there,
right,
you know, every now and then. But you fish the Upper Barren Fork, you're going to pretty much be in pure Neosho areas. And same with Caney Creek. If you get up away from the confluence, you're going to be mostly almost all Neoshos. And then a lot of the small tribs in the Grand River system.
Right.
They don't really have smallmouth fisheries in those reservoirs, so we haven't had that same issue up there. So if you have access, landowner access up there, any of those streams you're fishing are going to be pretty confirmed pure smallmouth or Neosho bass.
Grand Lake.
All the tributaries feeding like Grand Lake.
Yeah. I even hesitate to ask that question because I know there's some people listening right now like, how dare you ask where that's going to be and all that stuff.
Well,
and
you can't know unless you're educated.
And that's the thing
protect.
that, like, as I've been thinking about this and, like, I knew I was going to ask that question because at the end of the day, like, I totally get that and I don't want to ever, like, spot burn anyone's special spot. But at the end of the day, if we don't know where these things are and we don't understand, like, get people to know it, and then you can only really love something and care about it to protect it if you know it, and if you know about it and where it is. And so all of those things have to come together to be able to protect this fish. And so please don't hear me, anyone who's listening.
Hey, man,
like,
you can't spot burn a public access spot.
I hate you for asking that question.
Public domain.
But at the end of the day, like, if we're putting our money where our mouth is and we're like saying we actually do want to protect this, like, we got to know where they're at.
Yeah.
And the bottom line.
And Dr. Taylor's like, some of that original work basically headed off the same issue in Grand Lake that we have in Tenkiller because there was a lot of interest in making Grand Lake a smallmouth fishery as well. And his research was like, okay, let's see what we have here in these streams because we know we have this issue down here in the Illinois River. Let's sample throughout this. And that was also like, hey, these are different. Let's not compromise those. We think stream size might be a barrier, and a lot of those tribs they're small, so they might not go up there. But let's not chance it.
Yeah.
Let's not just blow out the entire Neosho range in Oklahoma by introducing smallmouth bass in there.
Yeah.
So we just need the anglers to get on board, thinking the same way, not take smallmouth bass from Tenkiller anywhere else and spread them.
Yeah.
Right.
If you want to fish smallmouth bass, come here and do it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that have your cake and eat it too options. Just I think it's a win-win for everybody. And you know, your alternative is you spoke to it earlier that it's on its own trajectory and we should just let nature take it. You have that side of it, but then you have the extreme, I guess, conservation outlook where you have states out west that have invasive smallmouth populations that they just have kill crews that go out and shock fish and they kill every smallmouth and they kill every northern pike they get their hands on. And I think generally speaking, it's probably not popular. Like I know it's not popular with the public, but I don't think any stream biologist dreams of their job being like, I'm going to take a shock boat out here and take every 20-inch fish I get and lop its head off and take it to the dump. Like no one wants to do that either. So I think the balanced approach with having big fish but still conserving what we have is the best way forward. And I kind of hope that people can get on board with something like that and not take it upon themselves to want to still move fish where they're not supposed to be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I do have a question about anglers, I guess. And, if you want to catch fish here and also with the kind of the hybrid approach, have your cake and eat it too approach, if you were to try and maybe not even reverse the damage already done in some of these larger streams and some of these systems where, I mean, they've been impounded for years, generations now, and it's like what's done is kind of done. But I'm thinking maybe the smaller streams with the higher percentage of a pure strain Neosho bass. What do you how many people, if you just had to put a number on it, how many people do you think it would take to really care about the Neosho, advocate for the Neosho, learn about the Neosho, talk about the Neosho with their friends and their fishing partners, and then just kind of watch over it?
That's a really good question. That I know it's something that some states are better at. Like I have some colleagues down in Alabama that work for their state agency down there, and they have all these there's one here, Spring Creek Coalition is probably the most well-known one, but it's basically landowner groups who have gotten together that say we have property that all go to this stream. We bought this property, some of us inherited this property, some of us bought this property because of this awesome stream. And now you find out you've got an animal in it that only occurs there, and you have a bunch of like-minded people that have direct access to that property that get together and say, we want to conserve this, we want to keep it the way it is. And I think that if you build upon that model and you have people taking ownership over their own stream, that's a good way to do that. But as far as putting a number on it, 250, I'm not really sure, but I think
I don't know if it's an answerable question.
No,
I just
yeah, right.
I
think the grassroots way of doing that is you have anglers who may live in suburban Tulsa or Oklahoma City. You have landowners, you have biologists, you have this diverse group of people who all want to care about this species and conserve it, and getting together and basically instead of the state obviously has a responsibility to come in and say we care about it too, and you should, and this is why. But I think when you have landowners doing it on their own without that, it makes it really, really powerful, where you and your neighbor are now working together to do something like that. So I think that would be the best approach in that. I don't really, I don't know how the state can mandate it, I guess.
Yeah, it just goes back to making as many people aware as possible, I think. And you have your conservation groups too, that a lot of them, they bear the name of a smallmouth just because for the longest time, that's what we've known it as. Right. So maybe it's you get in those groups and you're actually, it's a Neosho bass.
Yeah, maybe some rebranding.
So rebranding, or our access signs on these rivers, you can update those and say, this is the home of the Neosho bass. A little bit of information about it. Also, please don't move fish. Yeah. Some kind of, you see clean drain dry signs at all the boat ramps. You have signs that we do it for shad, right? With Asian carp, you're not supposed to, where you have Asian carp is prohibited from, cast netting shad and moving them to another water body because there might be an Asian carp in there. We're not trying to spread those. So maybe that same kind of outreach through signs at access points too, it just makes people know, here's your regulation. Also, by the way, there's a unique endemic species here.
Yeah.
So it really is an education thing first, is the way I'll see it. And having been in that world, that's still that's your personal as well as your professional opinion. Education really matters.
Yeah. Awareness is key. Like you said, if you don't know about something, then you probably don't have a vested interest in protecting it. And if you would have asked that question to the random angler, do you like big fish or native fish? You're do you like this fish that's only found here, and it's the only place on the planet it's found here, and it's only in these 3 or 4 streams, and it's the oldest lineage of smallmouth bass in the smallmouth bass lineage. Which one would you rather prefer? And I think you might have drawn a couple more people away from the size. I
think so too. And obviously there's a lot that goes into that. We've talked about people want to catch big fish. There's an economic benefit to having big fish in relation to tourism, people coming to stay the weekend, booking a guide, hanging out, even bass tournaments. I know those bring in a ton of money, but there has to be at some point where we draw the line and we say, hey, maybe for once in America's lifetime, we're not going to bow to the almighty dollar. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems like we've exploited so many different resources just so that we could make that next dollar and just, I don't know, get rich, I guess. But at some point, you have to draw the line to say, no, what we have here is worth protecting. This is our home. We care about it in the same way that, people and places are worth protecting. Species and animals are too. And so that just combined with the education and hoping that people care about it and know about it enough to do something with it and have that personal responsibility. I feel like is kind of the path forward.
You can even like step out at fisheries for a second and just think of like any cool landmark in the country, right? If you have the Statue of Liberty or like the Golden Gate Bridge or Mount Rushmore, like if every state had one, it's like, well, there's nothing unique about going to see the Statue of Liberty now.
Yeah.
So it's like, think about the environment or like the watersheds that you live in. And like, it's cool because it's unique. And if you ruin that, then it's just like everywhere else. It's like the other 40-some states you can fish smallmouth in.
Yeah.
Go there.
Yeah.
Like, keep the Ozark unique. I mean, everybody travels to certain places because there's something unique about that they love, whether that's the scenery or, something they're hunting or fishing because it's found there.
Right.
If you homogenize everything, like everything loses its flavor.
Yeah.
So the flavor of the Ozarks might be this diminutive little torpedo
Yeah.
that rarely gets over 12 inches. But hey, people eventually might come from all over to like say, hey, I caught this. And I came from I know Donovan Clariot Guide has had people come from all over to, check off that black bass diversity.
He's mentioned to us he had people from like London and Europe coming just
Japan.
to fish. Yeah, just to catch the Neosho.
Yeah.
Which is cool. But you're right. Like you can apply that to so many things, cultures mixing and losing identities and these blending pots and stuff like that. It's important to like, keep things separate to some extent enough to like keep them whole and intact. Trevor, you mentioned a word earlier that I really like, and I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this. You mentioned the word hope. What is your hope for the Neosho bass in the Ozarks?
Well, I mean, as corny as it is, like every state conservation agency has a mission statement, and almost every mission statement says something about conserving resources for future generations, which like on its face value, you're like, okay, that's great. But when you really stop and think about it, I still remember that first Neosho bass, likely, as we said earlier, likely a Neosho bass that I caught on the Barren Fork. And it's really, you have kids, things change a little bit, and it's really cool to think about that. Like, my hope is that my kids can come back here and maybe their kids can come back here and catch a Neosho bass. And that genome, that, only place in the world where this critter's found, that they can go back to that area and catch that fish too. And all the while, you spend a day on the Barren Fork catching little mustard torpedoes all day, and then maybe the next day you can come to the Illinois and catch a big smallmouth, and you have both of those things that I really care about and enjoy that my kids are going to get to. So that's my hope.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You want your grandkids to catch the granddaddy lineage of the smallmouth.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
I love
that new world record.
That's great.
That's right.
Yeah.
Tony, I'll ask you the same question, and maybe from like a management lens. What do you hope to see change within the management, or how can we, hope to manage this species better?
Yeah, I think just a focused effort, starting with awareness on the fact that it's unique. It is very limited in scope to these 4 states, and so getting all these state agencies like on board, it's really hard generally to get different state agencies working together and on the same page because everybody has different, projects that they're working on and priorities, and so like getting the states together is like a big step, but it would be huge to kind of make it like a range-wide type of campaign. So that would be awesome. And then just, if you can incorporate genetic monitoring into like the bass sampling that agencies are doing just to head off any potential future issues would be great too. And then just there are still like, mysteries of the Neosho bass that are yet to be found because it's just, we're still new into this discovery stage of like, well, we always thought this was a smallmouth, so we didn't like look into it that hard.
Yeah.
But like, so you can start answering some of those more questions that are out there still, like you can pick up that hybrid question of like, okay, we have this hybrid swarm. Like, is there something different about these hybrids? What's their rate of movement? Are they more likely to maybe go up a smaller trib and then basically ruin a smaller trib because the hybrids are more likely to like that smaller system than a pure smallmouth is, and start kind of looking at that. So just keeping the research going and starting that education campaign. And then, you can use regulations like we talked about to, promote the best part of a fishery, like the Illinois River, promote it as a trophy fishery, draw people that want that here, and then, put those regulations that encourage harvest of 14-inch fish and above elsewhere, just as a potential way to head off, any of those adult smallmouth getting in other systems.
Thank y'all so much for listening to our series so far, and keep sending it around to everyone you know. We have one more episode left, and you are not going to want to miss it because we've got a huge announcement. We'll see y'all next week.